Hello everyone, today's lecture is going to be on elections, campaigns, and voting. This happens to be the final lecture of the term, and in large part we've talked about some of this subject matter already in the term, right? We've talked about elections, campaigns, and voting. For instance, when I was lecturing on Congress or lecturing on the presidency. These are topics that you can't really speak about Congress or the presidency without bringing up in some degree. We'll get into a lot more detail as we go on about elections, campaigns, and voting in this lecture in particular. To begin, we probably don't need to spend too much time defining what these terms mean. We know what they are, right? These are just the things that determine what choices are available for the people to determine who fills the elected spots in the federal government, so senators, representatives in the House, and then the president. What choices are available to the people, and in particular, we'll be talking about 4 different things. So first, what are the procedures for elections in the United States? We'll talk about how our president's elected, and that's a fairly complex process, and then we'll talk in less detail about congressional elections, just because they're significantly less complex than presidential ones. Afterward, we're going to shift to a couple of different topics dealing with how elections are decided. First of all, we'll talk about individuals within the country, within the electorate. How do they determine, first of all, are they going to vote? So some people decide to vote, some people decide not to vote. So what goes into that decision? And then we'll talk a little bit about, among those people who do choose to vote, how do they decide for whom they're going to vote? So again, this is speaking in terms of individuals making choices as voters. Following this topic, we'll get into a related topic, but one that's somewhat distinct. What are the factors that characterize candidates that can help to determine who's going to win an election? So generally in presidential elections, we're talking about a Republican versus a Democrat, one candidate versus the other. What are the positive qualities that can help one candidate gain an advantage over the other and ultimately win? And then, one of the factors we'll identify in this discussion is sometimes having a good campaign infrastructure can help you. And this will lead into the final topic, where we'll talk about specifically what do presidential campaigns do in order to try to help their candidate get elected. Okay, so to begin with, we'll have a fairly extensive discussion about how presidential elections work, and then we'll get into a discussion of how congressional elections work. To start out with, the structure of presidential elections tends to be more complex than that of congressional elections, so this section of the talk will be comparatively long than when we get to talk about Congress. Here is a roadmap of how the presidential election cycle works, and you'll see it's got a lot of different steps. Typically, it can be thought of as beginning several years, really, before the actual voting date. Obviously, in the 2016 election, a month or so ago, it happened on November the 8th. The cycle, though, you could date it back a couple of years to where candidates were either announcing or beginning to put themselves out as potential candidates for president. So starting, anywhere from around 2 years out, you'll have candidates begin what's known as the invisible primary, and this is the portion before the official beginning where people start voting in actual primary elections, beginning in, sometimes late January, sometimes early February of a given election year. So during this period when candidates are announcing, this can be really important for garnering momentum. So all these other steps we're going to be talking about that follow that stage. The primary here, starting again in either late January or early February, getting into having a party nominee. At the national party conventions are where the actual person who wins the primary is formally nominated. You have an election campaign in the fall, an actual election day in the second Tuesday of November, actually, and then you have the Electoral College formally meeting to actually select who the president is going to be, which is this is the point where you actually get a president-elect. And then Inauguration Day, which, as fate has it, lands on the final day of this class, January the 20th. That's the culmination of the process. So we'll start getting now into some more detail about these various steps here that are depicted. Right, so the talk here will break down as makes sense in my opinion. First, talking about nominations, and then the general election. These are really distinct ways that these various election cycles work. The nomination as compared to the general election. So to begin, we have two major parties in the country. Obviously, the Republicans and the Democrats. The nomination cycle is when each party determines who is going to run on their ticket. The Democrats will have one candidate. The Republicans will settle on one candidate as well. The nomination cycle is how this is determined, who gains that spot on the party ticket. As a bit of historical background, if you look, in the relatively distant past at this point, it used to be just the party elites and the party apparatus sort of determining on their own who their nominee is going to be. There wasn't really much of a democratic process there. As it stands now, the parties have both reformed themselves, and the selection process for the nominees is mostly democratic, and we'll get into discussing here in a second why it's mostly democratic and not completely democratic, but in large measure, the people in each party are who are going to decide who the ultimate nominee is. Okay, and so to set things up, both parties operate on a delegate system. So starting in this year, or not this year, but last year now, 2016, the primaries started, I believe it was February the 1st. The Iowa caucus is how all this begins, really. That's the first contest where people are actually voting for the nominee. And so Iowa kicks it off at the beginning, the first and most famous caucus, and then you have a number of other states that go, and we'll talk about the difference between a caucus and a primary in a second, but basically the way this works is you start with Iowa, then you go to New Hampshire, then South Carolina. At least in the Republican Party, the ordering sometimes differs between Republicans and Democrats, but you're just sequentially going through each state, and sometimes sets of states on a particular voting day, and they're each having their own separate contests to see where their delegates go. So delegates in each party are allocated proportionate to the number of people in each party in each state. So states that have more Democrats are going to have more Democratic delegates at stake than states with less Democrats there. Same thing with the Republicans. And the first, this is the first major difference between the nomination cycle and the general election. In that the general election, everything happens on one day, and the presidential nomination, though, that it goes sequentially, so that momentum can start to play a much bigger role. Like Iowa, I just mentioned as the first contest, New Hampshire always the second. So even though Iowa and New Hampshire are comparatively small states to some other states, later on, winning them early on can have a really big role in giving you that early momentum, allowing you to win a lot of the states that are coming, in the bigger states where you can really start to rack up delegates. So in both parties, you need to accumulate over the course of the primaries a majority to win. Throughout history, or recent history at least, there's been a specific candidate that's done this for each party, that's gone through the various primaries and caucuses and won a majority of the party delegates. If you go back a few decades, though, there have been instances where no particular candidate won a majority. So in primaries, there can be more than two candidates vying for these delegates, so oftentimes it's speculated whether or not one candidate is going to gain an absolute majority. In the more common instance where they do get a majority, the candidate that gains that majority obviously gets the nomination. And in the rarer event where no one gains an absolute majority of delegates, it will then go to what's known as a brokered convention, which we're not going to get too much into, but basically there would be negotiations behind the scene to try to reallocate the delegates at the convention until someone can garner enough support on subsequent votes to win the nomination. But we're not going to talk too much about the specifics of how that would work. Okay, so I mentioned these two terms at this point, caucuses and primaries, and these are the two ways that states can allocate delegates, and we'll talk about those here in order. So, certain states, for their primaries, they have what are known as caucuses, and in a traditional election, we think of people, the polls open, and whoever wants to vote goes to the polls at some point when they're open, votes, and then leaves. Caucuses operate a bit differently. So Iowa's probably the most famous caucus state, as I've said. Nevada's an early on one that has a caucus. And the way this works is they're basically meetings that are typically going to be held later in the day, so after everyone's done with work. Whoever is interested in voting in the caucus shows up. There will be hundreds or however many across the state at various localities. So you go to your local caucus, and when you get there, so basically they'll start separating people into different camps. So if you to just use the recent example, if you're a Trump supporter, you go to one corner of the room. If you're a Rubio supporter, you go to another corner. If you're a Cruz supporter, you go to this other corner. And basically you're just separating people out into initial camps. And what's interesting here is then each side gets a chance to speak for a little while and say why their candidate should be voted on. Why, if you're standing in the Cruz corner, you should come over to the Rubio corner or whatever. So you get a chance to say whatever you want to say. Then eventually people start voting. And ultimately, the votes get counted in each caucus, and in large part, they're allocated the same as if it were a primary once the ultimate votes are counted. The difference here, though, is it takes probably 2 to 3 hours when you go to a caucus to ultimately finish the process, cast your vote, and get to go home. In a primary, it happens a lot quicker. So this has a couple of different effects in caucus states. First of all, less people are going to attend caucuses as opposed to regular elections, just because of the time commitment. A lot of people aren't going to want to just hang out for 3 hours at night listening to people talk to them about candidates. So that's going to depress turnout, and the composition of the turnout is going to differ as well. Typically, it's going to be more elite people in society. So those with higher interest in politics, higher socioeconomic status, those with a particular interest in politics. Those are going to receive higher representation in these caucus states. Especially those people that are highly partisanly motivated, really strong Republicans or really strong Democrats. That's what the demographic composition of a caucus is going to look like compared to a primary. Speaking of primaries, that's the other form that the elections can take in the nomination cycle. So primaries resemble a normal election to a pretty large degree. In a primary, you show up, you vote for the candidate you want to be nominated, and then you go home. So unless there's a really big long line, you're going to be in and out the door a lot faster than you would in a caucus state. What you need to know about primaries, though, is that the eligibility for them is a bit different than when you think of like a general election, for instance. In a general election, it doesn't really matter what party you're assigned for. The voting procedures are the same. You just go and you vote, and that's all. However, for party nominations, though, different states have different rules as to who's eligible to vote in the primaries. So in an open primary, you show up on primary day, and you get to choose which party you would like to vote for. So it doesn't matter whether you're registered as a Democrat or a Republican, or you have no party affiliation. You just show up and tell the person, I would like a Democratic ballot or I would like a Republican ballot, and that's you can choose whichever you would like. I don't know if there's any state that allows you to vote in both primaries. Generally you're going to be required to choose one or the other. On the other hand, there are other states that have what are known as closed primaries, including our state, New York, which most of us are probably residents in. So if we're registered to vote, most of us are probably registered in a closed primary state, so this can be relevant. In closed primary states, the only way that you can vote in one party's primary is to be registered for that party. Usually it has to be in advance. Most states don't allow you to register on the day of the primary, but some do. So if you're a registered Democrat, you don't have an option to cross over and vote for the Republican side unless you change your affiliation to the Republicans and vice versa. Also, importantly, if you're an independent, if you have no partisan identification, no registration, excuse me, that means you can't vote in either contest. If you want to participate at all in the primary, you have to register for one party or the other. Another third way that a few states do it is through what's known as a modified open primary, which means that you basically have an open primary as it pertains to independents who they can choose to vote for whichever contest they want to. However, there's no crossover voting for people who are registered for a party. So if you're a Democrat, you can't cross over to the Republican contest and vote there. One important aspect of what we're talking about here is that in a closed primary, the electorate is going to look considerably different than what it would look like in an open primary. So if you're, for instance, running in the Republican nomination contest, a closed primary state is going to be composed exclusively of Republicans, and so that's the only group you have to tailor to. You don't have to really consider independents. You would, in this case, in a closed primary, really just want to have a really strong Republican message. In an open primary, on the other hand, in those states, you're going to want to maybe try to court the independents a little bit. Maybe not have such a hardline stance if you're a Republican, or if you're a Democrat, not have such a hardline Democratic stance, but moderate yourself a little bit to determine, or at least try to determine, whether or not you can maybe advantage yourself by appealing to these independents who have the option to participate in an open primary. All right, so we've talked about how delegates are what matter in the nomination cycle, how in this sequential set of contests each state eventually votes, and the goal is to garner a majority of the delegates so that you can eventually win at the convention. So there are a few things that are idiosyncratic, first of all, by states and by parties in terms of how delegates are allocated. So in most states, you have a proportional allocation system. This meaning that if you win 60% of the votes in a state, the popular vote, you get 60% of the delegates for that state, roughly speaking. If you win 25% of the vote, even though you didn't win a plurality, in the example I'm talking about now, where someone else won 60%, you still get 25% of the votes in that state, the delegates, excuse me. So, in this sense, the proportional allocation tends to drag things out a little bit longer than it might otherwise. So you can't really gain a huge advantage in a short period of time unless you're really blowing people out in the contests. The proportional system can kind of make it a longer slog to where maybe you're winning every state at the start, but only by 5 or 10%, so your delegate lead isn't growing that much. So the proportional allocation mechanism can have the effect of protracting things a bit. This stands in contrast, though, to certain states, specifically in the Republican nominating contests, which are winner-take-all. So again, this is only in the Republican nomination cycle. For the Democrats, every state is proportional allocation. In certain Republican states, though, you have winner-take-all systems where whoever wins the plurality of votes, which could be sometimes a majority of the state, or sometimes if there are more than two major candidates still at that point in the nomination cycle, it could just be a plurality. So one candidate could win 40, and the other two split 30, just as an example off the top of my head. But regardless, whoever gets the most wins all the delegates for that state. And for the Republicans, there are a couple of really big states relatively early on in the cycle that have this sort of winner-take-all system. So notably, Florida and Ohio, two of the most delegate-rich states, they have winner-take-all contests. And last cycle, 2016, these happened toward the beginning of March. These two big contests, which is really the first chance to build up a really big delegate lead if you were running in that contest. The other states prior to that would have all been proportional allocation, so again, not as easy to gain that lead as the bigger states that are winner take all. Another thing worth noting as far as delegates go is Democrats have what are known as superdelegates in their system. This is generally only going to be applicable to the Democrats, what we're talking about here. But about 15% of the total delegates in their system, there are 4,700 total that you can win in the Democratic primary. So to win a majority, you need about somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,400. To get to that number, though, there are also 700 delegates which aren't bound to a particular state or any popular vote, and as superdelegates. So these would be these 700 people, typically composed of elite party officials or elected officials at the state or local level, and they can vote for whoever they want to at the convention, even if the popular vote in their state goes for one person. They can choose to support another at the convention. So in the Democratic contest, it's not only important to try to win the popular vote, but also to try to court at the same time behind the scenes these 15% that aren't tied to the popular vote. And so I said at the outset, the nomination cycle is mostly Democratic at this point, after the reforms each of the parties have instituted over periods of time leading up to now. The mostly is coming in here, in that the party itself, through the superdelegates on the Democratic side, they still have the ability to influence the outcome in a potentially non-democratic way that, in theory at least, could have the effect of overruling the Democratic outcome. Who won the most delegates allocated by the popular vote. As it turns out, though, this hasn't actually happened. There hasn't been a case yet since the superdelegate system was instituted, I believe starting in the 84 cycle, somewhere around that term, where the Democrats thought that the party wanted more of a say as to who got the ticket. Since then, there hasn't ever been a case that I just mentioned as a possibility where you have one candidate who wins the popular vote and the popular delegate total, and then the party comes in and takes it and gives the nomination to someone else through the superdelegates. Generally what happens is whoever's winning the popular vote throughout the spring and early summer in the Democratic contest, they'll get enough momentum to where someone's clearly the nominee before the superdelegates have to actually vote at the convention, and by that time most of the superdelegates will just then start to coalesce around the person who's the apparent nominee. It hasn't really been the case that there's been a holdout of superdelegates that are, like close to the full number are saying, all right, this person won the popular vote, but we want someone else, and we're going to do that at the convention. Usually there's a degree of consensus and unity between the superdelegates and the popularly elected delegates as we get to the convention. Okay, and so the nomination cycle concludes at the convention, as I've been talking about, where the delegates will all go and formally cast their vote, and presuming somebody has a majority of the delegates in each party, you get a pretty clean nomination at the conventions. Each of the nominees give a big speech that's watched by tens of millions of people on TV, and once the nominees are formally nominated by their party, this kicks off the general election cycle, which generally is running from roughly the beginning of August. I guess I think the Republican convention was in mid-July this year, but roughly speaking, August through October is what we think of as the general election campaign. And this, of course, is just the period of time when the Republican nominee and the Democratic nominee campaign against one another to eventually try to win the presidency. And we can think back to our lecture on the presidency and probably aspects of the lecture on the Constitution as well, we've discussed the Electoral College before, and so this is the indirect mechanism that the framers of the Constitution put in place to select the president. As it was originally conceived, electors to the Electoral College were left up to the states to decide in whatever way they wanted to. Most of them, in the first few elections, selected their electors through the state legislatures. Some of them had popular votes, but as we progress through time, all the states adopt popular voting to allocate their electors. So the Electoral College in total is comprised of 538 electors, or electoral votes, as they're sometimes referred to as. So this would be electoral votes from all 50 states, and then the District of Columbia actually has 3 electoral votes in the Electoral College as well. And so you need a majority in the Electoral College to win in the Electoral College, and in order to get to that, that's 270. As we saw in the most recent election in 2016, sometimes, historically speaking, relatively rare. This number 270, even if you reach it, sometimes you could lose the popular vote, but ultimately it's just the Electoral College that matters. Alright, so 538 electoral votes in total. The way that they're divvied out to states is based on 2 factors, both relating to the size of congressional delegations. So each state has 2 senators, as we've talked about before, and then they have a number of representatives that's proportional to the size of their state, their population. And the number of electoral votes that each state gets is equal to the number of senators plus representatives. And so if you're a really small state, there are states that have the minimum number possible, which is 3, which would be 2 senators plus 1 representative in the House. So states like Wyoming and the Dakotas have 3 electoral votes. Larger states, though, that have more population receive more electoral votes in proportion. So the state with the largest electoral vote share is California. They have the largest population in the country. They've got 55. So obviously, the more populous your state is, the more representatives you have in the House, and the more electoral votes you get. Now, in contrast to the nomination cycle, where we said that most states are proportionally allocated in terms of delegates, all of the states, with the exception of 2, in the general election, assign their electoral votes in a winner-take-all fashion. So, again, if you want a plurality, you get all of the votes in the state, all of their electoral votes. The 2 exceptions are Maine and Nebraska. These are 2 states where if you win the overall vote in the state, you get the 2 votes associated with the senators off the bat, and then the rest of the votes associated with the House, those are assigned within each district, each House district. So if you're in Maine, for instance, this election, Hillary Clinton wins the overall state vote, as well as the 1st congressional district in Maine, so she gets 3 electoral votes from that combined. Donald Trump, however, won a majority of votes in Maine's congressional 2nd district, which is in the upper and more rural part of the state, and so he gained 1 electoral vote from there. Nebraska, they didn't split their vote in the last 2 elections, I believe, but in 2008, when Obama was running for his first term, he won 1 particular district there. The 2nd, I believe, is what it was, which is a more urban district. It was where Omaha is located in Nebraska, the largest urban center in the state. He managed to win that 1 particular district, so McCain would have gotten 4 out of the 5 electoral votes in Nebraska, and then in 2008, Obama comes away with 1. It's just an interesting quirk of the system. The states can allocate, based on the vote however they want. Only 2 states, though, choose not to do winner-take-all. Alright, and so eventually we get to Election Day, and everyone votes within each state, and this is what we get. Each state counts up their vote, and then the electoral votes are allocated to each candidate in the way we just discussed. So this is the depiction of the recent election. Red, of course, being states that Trump won in. Blue, states that Clinton won in. Here's Maine. They split their vote, as we said. So eventually, one candidate usually gets over that 270 threshold, and they are considered the president-elect at that point. The status of being president-elect, though, in between Election Day and December when the Electoral College meets, is unofficial. You don't really get the official selection for president until the Electoral College meets, which was this year on the 19th of December. And so each state, basically, what happens is, first of all, whoever wins in a given state, so in New York, Hillary Clinton wins, so there's a set of electors set aside that get selected who are beforehand known to support Hillary Clinton, and they go and get selected to go and vote for Hillary Clinton when the state electors meet in December. This happens across the country on one day, and then they report back their electoral vote to Congress. What's interesting to note is that, in theory, electors, at least by the Constitution, aren't bound to select any particular candidate. So, in theory, they are able, if they're in a state that votes one particular way, they can vote, if they choose to, for a different candidate. So in some respects, they're unbound. In practice, though, it's not really ever been the case that the unbound nature of electoral votes has really come into play to that great an extent. So in this past example, there was a movement to try to get electoral college voters to not vote for Trump, who otherwise should have, given the way that their states chose to vote. It didn't really succeed that much. In some states, actually, there were a few faithless electors in the Electoral College, not just for Trump, actually. There were some voters who didn't vote for Clinton. Some of them voted for Colin Powell. I think one of them voted for Bernie Sanders. And then there were a few on the Republican side. One of them voted for Kasich. One of them voted for, I think, Ron Paul in Texas. Just people who'd had nothing to do with the election and weren't in serious consideration in any state, but because the Electoral College voters aren't technically bound, they could choose these people nonetheless, I guess, as a protest against whoever they were supposed to vote for. Interesting, though, some states have chosen to enact statutes that, I guess, allow them to invalidate and remove faithless electors in the Electoral College. So in Colorado, one of the voters who was slated to vote for Hillary tried to vote for somebody else, and she was actually replaced. So I don't know if it was a man or woman, but his or her vote was invalidated and replaced with another person who did go and vote for Clinton. So even though at a constitutional level, there's nothing saying that the voters have to vote a certain way according to their state vote, but the states themselves, they can put into place procedures that allow them to, basically take people out of the equation if they're not voting the way they should. Alright, so that was a fairly lengthy discussion of the presidential election cycle, starting from the nomination all the way up to the meeting of the Electoral College. And I guess a lot of you will have already been familiar with what we just discussed, given that we were in such close proximity to the last presidential election. Congressional elections are a lot simpler. There's not as much to discuss here. Typically, they operate starting with the nomination for each party as well. So the Republicans have a nomination contest to determine who's going to run in each congressional district, in each Senate seat that's up for election in each state. And then you have a general election vote. There's no Electoral College to worry about. It's generally just a simple plurality vote in whichever state or House district we're talking about, and whoever wins the plurality gets the seat. There are a few states that require a majority to win, and what happens here is if there's no candidate that wins an absolute majority, so let's say someone in the original vote, someone wins 49%, and the next closest person wins like 47%, and then there's maybe some third-party candidates with the remainder. What happens in these situations is those go to runoffs in the select few states that have this system. So in the runoff election, you just take the top two vote getters, and so those are the only ones that are on the ballot in the runoff election, and by definition at that point, someone has to win the majority. yeah, unless there's a theoretically there could be a tie, at which point who knows what happens. But after the runoff election, someone will win the majority, and then they get the seat. And in this election, a Louisiana Senate seat was up for election that fell into this category, where Louisiana is one of these states with this quirk on the books to where they have to have a majority to win. Neither of the major candidates received a majority to start out with on November the 8th. So then they just recently had a runoff election in which the Republican-affiliated candidate ultimately ended up winning the runoff election. Alright, so we just talked a lot about how elections are structured. Let's move on now to talk about how the votes are actually determined. What are the factors that lead people to vote one way or the other? That's what we'll talk about next, and then we'll get into what some candidates can do to help themselves when trying to gain votes. Alright, so to start out with, the vote decision is actually, it occurs in two steps. Most typically, we talk about the vote decision, as far as which candidate someone's selecting. Before that, though, we have to talk about whether or not you actually decide to vote. So this is called turnout. Do you decide to turn out to go at a given election and vote or not? A lot of people don't choose to turn out and vote. In terms of turnout and eligibility, it's worth, first of all, noting we've talked about several amendments to this point in the semester about extending the franchise. It's worth mentioning them again just to note that the group of people that are eligible to vote has been expanded considerably throughout the nation's history to where now most adults, with the exception of a few, notably felons, sometimes aren't eligible to vote in certain states, but pretty much everyone above the 18 is an eligible person to vote. We don't need to go into too much detail into each amendment. The 15th and 19th extend the franchise to different groups based on race and gender. The 24th is an important one on this note, in that up until it was passed, you would sometimes have taxes and payments that were required to vote, basically, that would make turnout a lot more difficult for people. And then finally, the 26th, up until this point, it was possible for states, if they wanted to make the voting age older than 18. However, now, by amendment, the maximum age that a state can have to make someone eligible to vote is 18. Alright, so getting back to the discussion of turnout and how do people decide whether or not to vote, there are a few different demographic factors that are relevant. So if you look at the data, gender matters. Women are slightly more likely to come out and vote as opposed to men. Age matters. Older voters are more likely to vote than younger ones. Income, those that make more money tend to vote in larger numbers than those who make less money. And education is another big one as well. So here's a chart just to point out one of these demographic trends we're talking about. This is charting turnout based on education, going back to the last several elections dating to 88, which would have been Bush versus Clinton. Alright, so 2012, if you look at this, just to take one example of the most recent election that's depicted here, when you look at the groups of people that are either at high school level education or less, you're looking at less than 50% turnout to vote. Go up to those that have a college degree, though, it goes all the way up to 72%, so a pretty substantial difference between those that have high levels of education compared to those that have lower levels of education. And the book discusses, beyond the demographic factors I just mentioned, the book discusses 3 separate models that have been put forth at various points in the scholarly history of the study of turnout to explain why people either choose to vote or not to vote. We can talk about those briefly. The economic model basically says that the decision to turn out or not is a cost-benefit calculation, so there are certain costs associated with voting, like most notably time. You have to take the time out of your day to go out to the polls. If you're employed, then this would mean sometimes taking time off work where you could be making money. Maybe you have to drive to the polls that cost some amount of gas. So there are some costs that are there in order to exercise your right to vote. The benefits, in comparison to the costs, involve how much do you stand to gain if the person that you want to win does win, as opposed to a situation where he or she loses. So are you that much better off if you're a Republican, if the Republican wins compared to the Democrat? This, though, and under this model, the key is that the benefits are discounted by the overall influence that your vote is going to have. Basically, the economic model would say that any given single vote, so in other words, your vote, for example, the probability that it's going to be decisive in the election is extremely small. So it's really unlikely, for instance, you're a voter in the state of New York, that you could cast a vote for Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, and that's the deciding factor. Either Clinton or Trump wins by that one single vote that you cast. So from this perspective, the ultimate outcome of the election is fixed, regardless of whether you vote or not. So the ultimate benefit of you voting is really minimal. Minimal in such a way that the costs, whatever they may be, tend to outweigh the benefit under this model. So really this paradigm ultimately suggests that it's really not rational to vote in most cases. The tension here develops, of course, when you compare the predictions of this model that most people shouldn't turn out to vote with the reality that turnout is actually quite extensive. People do come out and want to vote. So how do you reconcile this? People come out and they vote, and they spend time out of their day, even though their individual vote doesn't really have any chance of swaying the outcome of the election. So the psychological model is one way that this has been explained, and I wouldn't think of the psychological model as one specific model, as the name implies in the way they describe it in the book, but just a way of thinking in that you can think of a bunch of different psychological factors that help people overcome maybe the rational calculation that their individual vote isn't going to sway an election. So, for instance, throughout our life, we're imbued with this notion that we have a civic duty to try to maintain the system, and in order for the system to work, we've got to vote. We've got to do our part in society and be good Americans, and go out and have our voices heard. So in this way, we get some degree of psychological satisfaction by going out and voting. This has been known as like the warm glow effect is one way to describe it, I suppose. If you ever read it, Riker and Ordeshuk is the major paper associated with this, what's known as the D term, which is just what the terminology they use, which you don't really need to know, just to describe the overall positive feelings that people get from participating in the democratic system and helping to support it. Overall, though, within this psychological model, just anything that really makes you feel good about voting, you can think of it as being encompassed here. The institutional model, this is dealing with not psychological factors, but things that are going on in the context of the election that could sway you to vote one way or the other. So one contextual factor that may matter are the rules that are in place for voting. Some states have, for instance, early voting or mail-in balloting, which makes it easier. That it imposes less of a cost on you to mail a ballot in theory, than sometimes going into your car and driving and waiting at a polling place. So this reduces the cost of voting, which maybe increases the prevalence of turnout. There could be campaign or race-specific factors, like the closeness of a race, that influence whether someone chooses to turn out or not. So maybe people, for instance, in the state of New York, some people may not have come out to vote in the presidential election just because in the state of New York it wasn't a particularly close race. Hillary Clinton was it was pretty clear she was going to win the state of New York from the outset, but maybe in a closer election, more people would have come out and voted in New York. So the institutional model, just what's going on in the background and the context of the race, that can influence people to either turn out or not to turn out. All right, sticking for the moment on the topic of turnout, primary voting is interesting. I think I mentioned this before we were talking about it, that the average primary voter doesn't really look the same as the average general election voter. So in order to participate in a primary, you're going to have to be pretty interested in the process. You know, these are going to be people who are paying attention early on to the candidates, figuring out when the primary is, and going out and taking the time to vote just for a party nominee. You're not even actually voting for who gains the office at this point, but just who's going to run on the ticket later on down the line. And there are a large number of people who will go and eventually vote in the general election, but don't choose to participate in the primary election. And so overall, the primary electorate is going to be composed of more strongly partisan people, so people who are identifying with the Republican Party to a strong degree or Democratic Party to a substantial degree. These will be people who are more ideologically consistent and generally more ideologically extreme than general election voters as well. So people in the primaries would tend to be more strongly conservative or strongly liberal than those in the broader electorate. And so sometimes this can have the effect, at least in theory, of having more ideologically extreme candidates emerge from the primary than might otherwise be. You can imagine that if everyone who is going to vote in the general election would vote in the primaries, you would have a comparatively more moderate selection of the nominees, and maybe more moderate candidates emerge. So this is just interesting to note that when we're talking about turnout, there's a distinction to be made between primary turnout and general election turnout. All right, so now we're going to move from the question of turnout, and then now talk about how people actually decide who they're voting for, in the general election. When it's one candidate against the other, it's most often going to be a Republican against a Democrat. There are going to be cases where one party doesn't really contest a particular seat very much, but for most congressional seats or Senate seats, definitely presidential elections as well, you're going to have a Republican and a Democrat to choose between. And so what this generally means is that if I'm trying to figure out who you're going to vote for in the general election, and I can only ask you one question, the most information I can get is by asking you, are you a Republican or a Democrat? If you're an independent, that complicates things, of course, but if I know you're a Republican, I can know with a very high degree of confidence that you're going to vote Republican, and the same thing if you're a Democrat. Now, speaking in terms of partisanship, partisan identity, this is what we've talked about. I believe it came up in the first lecture on Chapter 1, where it's a psychological attachment to a particular party, the Republicans or the Democrats. You can feel good about one party, the Republicans, and bad about the Democrats, or vice versa, or you may not have any particularly partisan-oriented thoughts at all. But we're talking about partisan identity. We can decompose it into a couple of different components which mirror a few of the ones that we discussed in the public opinion lecture last time. So we can think of direction of partisan identity, which, are you a Democrat or are you or a Republican, excuse me. So a dichotomous distinction here as far as which direction your partisanship goes. We could also decompose it into strength. So you're going to have people among those that identify as either a Republican or a Democrat that are either strong in intensity or relatively weak. And given these things, if you're a strong Republican, there's a pretty high degree of certainty you're going to be voting with the Republicans in any given election. If you're a relatively lower intensity Republican, maybe there's a higher chance you go and cross over to the Democratic Party, or maybe you're less motivated to turn out because of the fact that you don't care as much as somebody who is a really intense, extreme Republican. And so in this respect, partisanship matters sometimes for both how you vote and whether you turn out or not. In terms of partisanship, this is the lay of things if you chart it back through the last couple of decades. So these data may have gotten cut off on the screen, but I believe they're from Pew. So they're a survey firm that asks at regular intervals in surveys Do you identify as a Republican or a Democrat or neither? And they can chart that through time as a result and see how the patterns move. So looking at this is going back to, looks like about 1990, yeah, about 1990, I suppose, all the way up to, I think it's current at this point, even though it says 2015, I believe the data end at 2016. So the general trend between this time is that the Democrats tend to have an advantage in partisan identity, somewhere, looks like in the neighborhood of anywhere from like 3 to 4 points up to an upper bound of maybe 7, 8, 9. So the Democrats tend to have an advantage throughout pretty much all of this series. What's interesting to note is at the end here, you see in the last few election cycles, the Democrats maintain a fairly sizable advantage in identification. However, this is illustrating that just having this advantage alone doesn't guarantee you a win, right? So in this period, you have like the 2010 election, which wasn't a great outcome for the Democrats. 2012 was somewhere around here, which they did do well, but then you also have the 2014 midterms and the most recent 2016 election. These are so 3 out of 4 recent elections there probably didn't go the way the Democrats would have hoped. So just because they have this advantage doesn't mean it's necessarily translating automatically into electoral victories. Another pattern worth noting here is the general trend toward de-alignment as opposed to partisan alignment. So you see the gray time series here indicating independents, those who don't identify as either a Republican or a Democrat. Their proportion in the population is increasing all the way up to 40 here, which is the highest level anywhere on this series. And you can see in terms of rough trends, the share of Democrats and Republicans seem to be going down a little bit, and that makes sense. You see the independents go up, and then the overall share of people who identify as either party, as either Republican or Democrat, that's going down. And like I said, you'll sometimes hear this overall trend referred to as partisan de-alignment. Alright, so next, partisanship is a big factor in who you vote for, obviously. The biggest factor, I think most political scientists would agree. And while partisanship can be a really important and maybe a determining factor in some people's votes, ideally we'd also like people to have some amount of issue content in the ultimate decision to vote for one candidate or another. We don't really want people ideally to go into the ballot box and look and see whether there's a D next to the person's name or an R next to the person's name when deciding who to vote for. We'd like people to also have some degree of knowledge of where the candidates stand on issues, and think about whether their own positions and preferences on the issues align with each candidate's, and have that influence how they ultimately vote. The thing about issue voting, though, is it's harder than voting based on strictly partisanship, right? The choice to vote based on partisanship just involves a really simple comparison. Am I a Democrat or a Republican? Alright, if I'm a Democrat, let me vote for the Democrat. If I'm a Republican, let me vote for the Republican. It's a really simple calculus there. Issues require a comparatively high amount of knowledge and information and a comparatively high amount of effort. So first of all, you have to be aware of various issues, know what the issues are, develop your own opinions on the issues. You have to develop some degree, the issues have to develop some degree of importance or salience for you. If you just don't care about any given issue that much, then issue voting isn't really an option for you. And you also have to have knowledge about the candidates' positions, and this can be difficult for a couple of different reasons. One, it's just more information you have to collect, and two, the candidates can sometimes have incentives to be ambiguous in the positions that they portray to the electorate. So maybe a candidate doesn't want to risk alienating people who disagree with him, so he or she puts out a wishy-washy or inconsistent position. So in this respect, trying to figure out where you align compared to the candidates based on a wide array of issues is really, it can sometimes be a really difficult challenge, and maybe people aren't doing this as often as they can because of these challenges. And the final thing we'll talk about that may influence people to vote for one candidate as opposed to another are the actual qualities of the candidates, the candidate him or herself. So, partisanship may matter. We hope that policy preferences matter to some degree, but the personal traits of a candidate are undeniably important as well. And these are probably being integrated to varying degrees based on what election we're talking about into the ultimate vote choice. So these would be things like the traits of the candidate, the personality. Are they likable? Are they not likable? Are they trustworthy? The background of the candidate. Some candidates are more relatable than others given their background. Even things as superficial as physical appearance can matter. Is the candidate attractive or not? And thinking in terms of more recent elections, we can think of a number of different items that potentially benefited winners like Barack Obama, who is a comparatively younger guy of a African American background, which is maybe appealing in the 2008 election to younger voters, African American voters, compared to someone like McCain, who's an older, more traditional gentleman. In 2012, Mitt Romney's kind of has this elitist background, not in a pejorative sense, but just in terms of being a prominent businessman and the type of social milieu he's in. It's distinct from Obama's. Donald Trump, we can speak about him in terms of his personality and traits potentially appealing to certain voters as well. Obviously, turning off some is at the same time. Point being here, not passing judgment on these various traits or personality items or background items that we can think of that characterize these candidates, just to say that certain traits are going to appeal more to certain voters, as well as background. All these things can sometimes sway the way people vote. And now, moving away from these factors we've talked about that can cause an individual to vote one way or another, let's talk about things in a broader sense now, and what factors there are that might sway the overall outcome of an election, who wins and who loses. At the outset, it's worth noting that momentum can often have a really large effect on the ultimate outcome of elections, so having a front-runner status can help you a lot, especially in the primary. When we talk about the primary, recall that it is sequential in nature. One state votes, then another state votes, and then maybe 5 or a dozen or so vote at once. It's going and stretching over the course of months that this process takes place. The general election, on the other hand, happens on one single day. There's early voting as well, of course, but it's a much narrower time frame than compared to the primary cycle. So the primary cycle, if you can establish yourself beforehand in the invisible primary, which is, like we said, the period leading up to the first voting, if you can establish yourself as someone who's seen as the inevitable winner, this gives you a great advantage going forward. Especially in the 2016 election, this is a particularly good example of this. So Hillary Clinton, of course, she's seen as the heir apparent to the Democratic presidential nomination going back probably even before she officially announced. I think it was pretty widely speculated that she would run and had the greatest chance of winning should she run. And eventually you go forward, and she's viewed as a front runner in the Democratic Party. This particularly helps her in that she secures a lot of the super delegates we talked about early on, and basically Bernie Sanders puts up a pretty decent fight there for a while, but he's never really able to overcome her, and Hillary Clinton sort of remains in the driver's seat most of the time, and eventually wins. Donald Trump, the same thing. He's not obviously seen as a front runner going far back as Hillary Clinton, but once he announces, he has a pretty rapid rise in the polls. And although certain people were saying things like he'd lose eventually, or he'd implode, or people would get sick of him, he's in front throughout the fall of 2015 and the early winter before voting in 2016. And he never relinquishes the lead either. So having that early momentum, it can really help, especially in the primary, where there's more of a snowballing effect. As you gain more and more delegates and you get closer and closer to the nomination, as compared to the general election, where most of it goes on at one point in time. Moving on now to a set of factors that's more associated with the general election, let's talk about them now in order. This set here will be 5 things that have a tendency to cause one candidate to do better in an election than the other. So the first being partisanship in the electorate. We mentioned how this is a big influence on how individuals decide who to vote, and so that being the case, the balance of partisanship in the electorate is going to tend to sometimes push things in one direction or another. If you're running for the presidency, you would expect to overall do better if there are more people in the country that identify with you as opposed to the other party. We can go back to this chart that we showed earlier, and this is sometimes the case that it helps. For instance, here's the 2008 election, which seems to be the highest advantage for the Democrats as compared to the Republicans, somewhere around the lines of 8, 9, 10 points here. And they do really well in 2008, though, as we said, electoral outcomes aren't always a guarantee just based on the partisan balance. The Democrats just ended up losing the presidency, even though they maintained this advantage. So, overall, you want your party to have an advantage as far as identification goes, but it's by no means a guarantee. So next, presidential approval. We talked about the factors that could influence this back in the presidential lecture. Obviously, if you're an incumbent, the better you're doing, the more likely you're going to be able to win re-election. If the economy's doing well, if people like you personally, there aren't any major, really obvious, identifiable crises going on, you're going to be in a lot better position to win re-election in that case. Where things get a little bit more dicey is when we're talking about elections such as the 2016 election, when the incumbent is term limited, and so you have 2 people going against one another who aren't incumbents. Hillary Clinton had never been president, and Trump had never been president. So the role of presidential approval of the incumbent in this case is kind of uncertain. We can look back at recent elections and see examples where maybe the incumbent president had some effect on the person who was running on his party ticket in the next election. So like in 2008, this is a period where George W. Bush is ending his second term as a really unpopular incumbent, and that could have be argued that it affected McCain to some degree, that people were less likely to want to support McCain, another Republican, because of the state of the current government under the incumbent Republican president. On the other hand, though, there are examples of elections where the pattern is kind of the opposite of what you might expect. So we can look at the last 2 Democratic presidents, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. They either have or will be leaving office as fairly popular presidents. The economy didn't really have anything too dramatically bad like Bush did toward the end of his term, and Clinton was popular when he left. Obama's numbers suggest that he's going to be in a few weeks when he leaves office and Trump takes office, Obama will be a fairly popular incumbent. However, in the two elections following them in their second term, you have Al Gore losing as the Democratic nominee in the 2000 election, and then Hillary Clinton losing as the Democratic nominee in the 2016 election, even despite the fact that these are both pretty well-liked presidents. In the 2000 case, Al Gore maybe tried a bit to run away from Clinton and not associate himself with him too much. Hillary Clinton, though, in 2016, she, in some respects, tried to portray herself as a third Obama term. So even though he was really popular, this didn't translate into a victory for Hillary Clinton in 2016. So presidential approval, when you're not talking specifically about an incumbent running for re-election, but rather a new person, a new party nominee coming in and trying to take advantage of it, it's not always a consistent effect. The economy, in general, beyond just its effect on presidential approval, the economy is maybe the single biggest factor in terms of who wins an election. If the party's doing well, actually the economy's doing well, the party that's in power tends to do well in the election. If the economy's doing poorly, whoever's in charge of the government tends to do poorly in turn. So pretty intuitive how the relationship works there. Incumbency, we talked about incumbency advantage in the context of Congress, where it's oftentimes relevant many times throughout someone's career where they're running for re-election as an incumbent in either the Senate every 6 years or the House of Representatives every 2 years where you don't have any term limits here. However, if you're the president, you may run for re-election one time, and in this one instance, incumbency can help you still. Obviously, it's not going to, because of the term limits, you're not going to write it to success over and over again like people in Congress can often do, but in that one chance you get to run for re-election, the state of being an incumbent has a number of advantages. So first of all, you don't have to go through a primary. The entire nomination phase we talked about in that discussion over how elections work, pretty much every time the sitting party has the president in power, they tend to just go ahead and renominate that person without any sort of fight. You can go back to past decades where, like, Gerald Ford had a challenge from Ronald Reagan in 76, and then 1980 Jimmy Carter had a challenge as well. Generally, though, that's the exception. When there's a sitting president, the party generally just wants to renominate them and not have to fight it out at all through the primary cycle. So usually you won't have any serious challengers emerge to go up against a sitting president. So this is good. For instance, your Barack Obama in 2012, the Republicans just had a pretty long fight. To some degree, maybe the person coming out of that long primary fight is damaged, and you just get to sit there and start after the conventions, fresh and clean, with no real damage done to you through that primary cycle. Another advantage is recognition. If you're the president of the United States, everyone knows who you are, whereas if you're just coming out as a party nominee, a lot of people are going to know who you are by the time you gain the nomination, obviously, as you go through that long, extensive cycle. But maybe some people don't, and you still need to work to reach out to them, and you haven't found everyone that may eventually get onto your side. Campaign experience, this is another big one. So if you're the president, by definition, unless you've taken office via the death of the sitting president, if you have won a national campaign already. If you're sitting in the office, you know how to win the office. So knowing this, that gives you the experience to say what worked, what didn't work, and you'll have the pieces in place in a lot of respects already from what you did to have that success originally. Like in 2012, a lot of the same strategies, a lot of the same infrastructure that Obama used to win victory in 2008, they replicated in 2012 to a high degree of success. So in these respects, being the sitting president, having that incumbency, can accrue you a large set of advantages. Organization in the campaign. So this is something that can matter, and we'll talk about the details of what campaigns do more here in a second. But in general, sometimes there's a degree of variance in how well organized campaigns are. In the most recent election in 2016, most people probably would have said that in terms of traditional organization, Hillary Clinton had an advantage over Donald Trump, which most before the election would have speculated that this would help her win, but as it turns out, the organization wasn't the decisive factor in this particular election. In general, though, we'd still think of having a better campaign organization to do things like reach voters, try to improve turnout. Things like this can all be helped by a good campaign organization. So this is the final factor that we're going to talk about that can help to decide the outcome of an election. We're, as a matter of fact, going to talk now in a higher degree of detail as far as what campaigns do, what they look like. Alright, and so A good way to think about campaigns is to just think of them as advertisements. You can think of it in the same way as when some firm is bringing a new product to market. They need to do a couple of things. They need to make people aware that the product is available, and they need to portray it in a positive light so that people will actually want to buy it. If you're a candidate, oftentimes one of your big initial tasks is putting your name out there and becoming a known quantity. Ultimately, though, you want to not just be known, but also have people like you, so that they'll eventually go and vote for you. So these are the two broad goals of the campaign: advertisement in terms of exposure, and advertisement in terms of favorability in garnering support. And the way the advertisement campaign works, if we're going to stick with that analogy, it's not a campaign that's universal and distributed evenly throughout the entire electorate. So given the way the Electoral College is set up, it has the effect of oftentimes focusing the election on a few specific swing states that if they go one way or the other, this will determine who wins the election. Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, those are three of the ones that in most of the recent elections have been pretty close. And so you see here on this graph, these hands are indicating individual campaign stops. The dollar signs on this bottom chart are showing basically the amount of money spent in a given area. This would be the 2000 election, I think, is what's being plotted here. It looks roughly the same, though, if you plot it in any other election since then, just given that the swing states haven't changed a ton. There have been others added, like Virginia and North Carolina are more swing states than they were in 2000. But this is just showing trying to prove the point that all the campaign stops, just indicated by the density, they're really concentrated in these swing states. So Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida. There are some Midwest states that were also contested. The money is being distributed, really concentrated at these states as well. So in terms of advertisement, it's most important, given the Electoral College, to target a specific set of states that you need to garner those 270 electoral votes. And so that's going to result in your efforts being concentrated there. All right. So in the course of campaigning, you're going to have four broad goals as far as how to eventually win. First being turnout. So you'll have a set of people that are predisposed to vote in your favor, generally. And maybe the biggest goal of a campaign is getting these people to actually go on election day or through early or absentee voting and vote for you. So if you're a Republican, for example, you'll know beforehand that Republican registered voters are going to have a high chance of voting for you. Same if you're a Democrat. The campaigns will have other means of identifying these people who have a high predisposition to vote for them as well, beyond just party registration. And you're going to try to get in touch with these people, especially in these swing states we talked about, and remind them the election's coming up. This is what day it is. Especially if it's a primary, people may not know. In a general election, most people are going to know when election day is, but you'll be reminding them that the election's coming up. Maybe you tell them where their precinct is. You let them know if they have some sort of need for transportation. That oftentimes campaigns will make it available. Basically, getting in touch with people and convincing them to actually go to the polls to the greatest extent that you possibly can get them to among this group of people that you think will vote for you. And on a related note, among this group, a similar effort is going to be aimed at keeping them loyal, making sure that their support doesn't shift from you to the other candidate. So this will be like, if you're a Republican, you're not going to want to do things. During the election, you may want to adopt some more moderate policies to try to garner some independents to come over to your position, but you're not going to want to go too far away from your base that you alienate them and risk losing them to the competitor. In a similar note, though, to the opposite effect, you're going to want to try sometimes to get defectors from the other side to abandon their support for the other candidate and come over to you. And the degree to which this happens will vary. Sometimes you'll see candidates try to make a big effort to get crossover vote. Other times not really, because this is a really difficult task, getting people who are, if you're a Republican, to get Democrats to vote for you, or a Democrat to get the Republicans to vote for you. So more often you won't see as much effort on defection as much as maybe persuasion, which is getting the people that are in the middle, that are either ambivalent about the candidates or are moderates, to where they don't have a specific ideological predisposition one way or the other, getting these people to come over to you. And this is oftentimes going to be an easier task than doing this, trying to get the people that are on the opposite end of the spectrum to come over to you. And the way you're going about doing pretty much all four of these goals, first of all, is by communicating with people, by putting out messages that are effective to those goals. And so, the act of getting people to turn out, you'll be putting out campaign communications, trying to convince people to either vote for you or vote against the other candidate. This is also going to be a really big subject in your campaign messaging. And this is such an important topic that each campaign is usually going to have a large staff of people whose job is specifically to determine what the campaign is going to say to the people and to the press. This will be done through things like joining focus groups to try to test out beforehand different ad campaigns that you're considering, maybe some polling about specific framing of issues. Sometimes candidates will just go out and maybe before a smaller audience try out a particular saying or phrase that they're thinking about using, see how it's reacted to, and then go ahead and if it's received well, apply that in a bigger speech later on through just a trial and error process. And so determining what to say in order to paint yourself in a more positive light than the competitor, this is really a core function of a political campaign. Another core function is what's known as field operations, and this is really closely tied to what we talked about in the last section on organization, possibly advantaging one candidate over another. When we talk about field operations, these are basically what people on the ground are doing in order to influence the election one way or another in favor of their candidate, either through turnout or persuasion, things like this. So this will involve activities like going door-to-door canvassing, calling meetings, orchestrating local fundraising efforts. These are all the sorts of things we talk about under the guise of field operations. And finally, let's conclude by saying that all the things we're talking about here in this section are really contingent on money. In order to have effective messaging put out, in order to have any sort of extensive field effort, you have to have money. It's really the lifeblood of a campaign. And for some perspective, going back to the election before this last one, to 2012, the combined campaign spent about $2 billion, also about $1.8 billion this past election. So really, a large degree of spending is involved here. Really the only reason we had a slight downtick here is Trump's been considerably less than other more recent candidates have. Hillary Clinton was right up there over the $1 billion mark as far as her expenditures in the campaign. This is charting the growth over time, and you can see, particularly in more recent elections, there's been a really rapid increase in how much these campaigns are spending. And you could recall back, we talked briefly about campaign finance back during the interest group lecture. So we were talking about political action committees there and their efforts in donating to campaigns. So that's important what we talked about then. Let's talk now about what individuals can do. So we were talking about mostly in the guise of interest groups back then. Individuals are obviously also really important as far as raising money. The campaigns want to get as many people donating as much as they can. Let's reiterate here, though, that campaign contributions in our system are generally limited in the amount that people can donate. This chart showing that if you're an individual, you are limited to, actually the limit's been raised to $2,700, so this chart is a bit out of date, but $2,700 to any given candidate, that's the limit. However, one thing to note is that you can give that number in both a primary election and then in a general election. So in this sense, you can give a little bit more, but you're still fundamentally limited to that $2,700 in each phase. You can give comparatively more to each party. So if you wanted to give 30,000, for example, to either the Republicans or the Democrats, you can do that. And this can help too in that sometimes, at least in presidential elections, the party will assume some responsibility for things like field operations. So Trump's campaign in this recent election, just for an example, they maybe didn't have as much of a field operation going on their own, but the Republican Party had a pretty extensive one in many states there to pick up the slack for them. And then finally, individuals can give $5,000 to each political action committee. So only $5,000 to any particular one, but they can donate to multiple ones if they really want to spread their wealth around. And it's worth noting that on this chart, super PACs aren't listed, which has sort of become the number one way that campaigns can get around financing limits. We talked about super PACs back during the interest group lecture. These would be groups, just to remind you, that they make independent expenditures that aren't directly connected to the campaign. So they can advocate for Hillary Clinton or for Donald Trump, but they can't call either of them up or their campaign people and ask how the money is going to be spent. So as long as the Supreme Court's ruled that as long as the the PAC expenditures are independent, these super PACs can take however much money they want from any individual given donor. So really, wealthy people can influence things to a much greater degree through the super PACs than they might otherwise be able to, given the statutory limits on what you can contribute to campaigns or regular PACs or parties. Okay, and that concludes the lecture on campaigns, elections, and voting, the final lecture of the course. So at this point, if you have any questions about what was said in this lecture or any of the other lectures within this unit, please get in touch with me as always before the final. And if not, good luck. Hope you learned something this semester, and I'll see you later.